This might surprise you, but I was able to whip out most of the apps I showed you on this channel pretty quickly, from just a few hours to not more than a couple of days. That's super important because if I can build an app quickly, I can get feedback on the initial version or MVP and then make improvements before releasing a new version that people will actually want to pay for. I follow a 5-step process for every app that I build, whether it's a simple app or a more complicated one with lots of screens and fancy logic. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you my 5-step process with you and show you how you can use this exact system to create almost any kind of app very, very quickly. By the end of the video, you'll have a plan that will help you build apps quickly and easily. Now, before we continue, as always, all the apps that I'm going to be showing to you in today's video are going to be available to view and or clone from my Patreon community, and you're going to see a link to it in the description below. Now, the first thing that I do when I'm trying to build a new app, regardless if it's going to be a very, very simple app or a complicated app or a super complicated SaaS app, is that I sit down with a pen and paper and I start drawing out the diagram. Now, here are a couple of diagrams, here are a couple of ideas from some of the apps that I built before. So here's a map app that I built previously, and here's a delivery app engine that I built as well. And here is a diagram for a site AI generator. Okay, these are actual working diagrams that I drew when I started building those apps, and then I scanned that back into the computer in order to show you guys what they look like. Now, you may be wondering, why am I starting from here? Why am I not, thinking about the database, the logic, or anything like that? Well, the simple answer is that when I am starting to build an app, I want the app to first look exactly how I want it to look. I want to have full control over the app from the get-go. And typically when I'm building apps, I have an idea of how I want the app to look, right? I have an idea of how I can make it interesting, how I can make it, useful to people, and how I can make it powerful. And by starting from this angle, I set the pace for the rest of the app. I'm basically telling myself that I'm going to go out and I'm going to build the app exactly how I want it to look, and everything else is going to conform to this UI. And the other reason is that when you're building apps, your users are going to be interacting with the UI. Your users are not going to care, how you've implemented the logic, what language you're using, how's your database structured, whether it's relational or non-relational or SQL or NoSQL. They're not going to care about all that. The only thing they're going to care is the ease of use and whether the app is going to help them in any meaningful way. And they're going to be interacting with the UI. And so these two factors make it super important for me to start with the UI. The next thing that I think about is whether the app that I'm building is going to be data heavy or it's going to be logic heavy, or if it's going to be a mix of both. So what exactly is data heavy? And what exactly is a logic heavy? So here I have a ton of apps that I built over the past year or even more. And if you had to categorize these apps, you're going to see that some apps are data heavy and some apps are logic heavy, but there are also apps that are kind of a mix of both. So as an example, let's say you're building something like a car rental app, which is kind of an Airbnb for cars, right? Well, ask yourself, is this app gonna be, relying on lots and lots of logic to do something interesting and things like that? Or is this app gonna be mostly about pulling data and reading data to some data source? Well, in my opinion, this is a perfect example of an app that's mostly data heavy, right? You're gonna have your typical screen with the list of different offers. You'll be able to search them, you'll be able to filter them, then you'll be able to click on a particular offer and see the detail screen like we have here now, and then you'll be able to book it. Now, of course, this app has some logic, right? All apps have a certain level of logic, otherwise it's going to be a website. And yeah, you'll have to implement certain logical things, but compared to the data aspect, this is mostly a data heavy app. You're mostly going to be spending time thinking about ways of structuring this data, whether to use collections, sub collections, or not use sub collections at all. You're mostly going to be thinking about the data aspect. You're not really going to be thinking too much about the logic, especially if you're building this app with a powerful no-code tool, because the logic there is going to be taken care for you. Here's another example of an app that I built. This is a hotel booking app with WorkFlow. And as you can see, this is very, very similar to the previous example. This is going to be mostly a data heavy app because you're going to be thinking about Firestore, you're going to be thinking about Firebase, or maybe you're going to be thinking about Supabase and relational table. You're not really going to be thinking too much about the logic. You're not really going to be thinking too much about the algorithm. This is going to be another example of a data heavy app. On the other hand, here we have a Tinder clone, or a dating app that works kind of like Tinder. Okay, this is a no-code dating app Flow. And this app is going to be mostly logic heavy, right? Yeah, you're going to have your users, you're going to have people that are interested in matching up. You might have some other information, but even so, you're looking at one or two tables or one or two collections. For the most part, what's going to set this app apart is going to be the logic aspect. And that is why if you look at this diagram, you see a lot of like intricate things happening here. We need to figure out, whether there's a match, right? If I try to match somebody, is the other person going to match me? If yes, do this. If not, do that. There's kind of a matching aspect to it, and that means this is going to be mostly a logic heavy app. Now, an example of an app that's kind of a mix of both, there's the logic aspect and there's kind of the data aspect, is something like Uber Eats or Uber or Bolt or any of these aggregators, right? You have your data aspect because there's lots of data happening. You have your users, you have your clients, you have your cars, you have this, you have that. But you also have a big logic aspect, right? You need to match the consumer to the producer. You need to match the user to the service provider, right? Now, I would even say the logic aspect, it's still gonna beat out the data aspect, even though you're gonna have a mix of both there. Now, in this next step, you're actually gonna go deeper and start thinking about how you're actually going to implement the algorithm or the data structure in your app. And really, if you're building more of a logic heavy app, this is where you're going to be spending most of your time. So here we have a Tinder type dating app with a little bit of Chat GPT AI built in that I built maybe a week ago, and you can view and or clone this app from my Patreon page. And so this is a perfect example of a logic heavy app because there's lots of logic happening, right? So if you open up the swipeable stack, and I'm using WorkFlow, which is one of my favorite no-code builders, you can see that we have 8 actions here, right? So we're going to open that up. And as you can see, we have an action on left swipe, we have an action on right swipe, and there's all of these things happening. And this is something that I had to think about when I'm actually building the app. This is something that I had to make sure works correct. But not only do you have action happening on the main page, you also have different things happening on the other pages, such as chats or messages. Another example of an app where you're going to be thinking about the logic aspect is this Chat GPT voice assistant that I built maybe a week ago as well. And this is an app where we are going to be using a custom action called speech to text. And you have to think, how can you integrate this custom action with your app? Well, there's lots of action stuff is going to be happening because if you click on this button and you go in here, we have a bunch of actions here. We have various things happening. We have this custom action. We wait a little bit. We make an API call. And then depending on the results from that API call, we're going to be doing something else as well. And so here's another example of an app where you have to kind of sit down and think about the action flow. And on top of it all, one of my first requirements when I sat down to build this app in the initial stages, when I started to think about the flow, the UI, and how the app is going to behave, is that when I press this button and I start speaking, I wanted to make sure that my speech appears in real time. And that meant that I need to worry about various other things. I needed to configure this speech to text aspect to write to the proper field. And that field needed to be real time so that it's displayed automatically. And actually, this is another really good example of building an app to suit you instead of the other way around. And this is why I first focus on the UI and I make sure that the app that I'm building is exactly the app that I envision and exactly the app that people are going to be delighted to use. Now, for this next step, which is very important, you want to go out and you want to build a prototype fast. You want to build a working prototype, a working proof of concept very, very quickly. And this is an important step because let's say you know the kind of app you're going to be building, you have your UI, you drew it out on a piece of paper, you thought about the data aspects, you thought about the logic, but unless you can build an actual proof of concept, an actual prototype, none of that matters. Because when you sit down and you log into your favorite no-code tool and you start thinking about actually building an app using this tool, you need to translate all of those ideas, all of those thoughts, all of that into the app that you envisioned. And depending the kind of app you're going to be building, you have to think and you have to consider lots of variables. The first thing you have to ask is, how can you build this app using your no-code tool? The second thing you're going to ask yourself is, the app you're going to be building in your no-code tool, is this going to be all built-in functionality? Or you may need, custom stuff like custom functions, custom widgets, custom actions, stuff like that. And so if we log into my WorkFlow account, you will see that first of all, I build lots and lots of apps. And the first thing that I need to do, the first thing that I must do whenever I embark on a mission to build an app is I need to get out a proof of concept ASAP. I need to make sure that my vision is real, right? And so depending on the app that we have, right? Some apps are built entirely with WorkFlow, right? There's nothing custom. I'm not using any custom widgets, custom actions, or anything like that. But there are also many apps where I need to do something custom. So for instance, let's say we have a map app, right? If I open this app, I know that I will need to do something very, very custom. And as a result, I have a custom widget here. I have a custom widget that displays Google Maps and also can do real-time tracking, real-time directions, and can even show you real-time movements. And this is going to be perfect if you are building some kind of an Uber Eats clone or an Uber clone or anything of that sort where you need to show the person's real-time location on the map. And this is a perfect example of a type of app which you can't really build entirely with WorkFlow, okay? Because WorkFlow does not give you this functionality. But fortunately, WorkFlow makes it super easy for you to integrate other code inside of your app. And this is exactly what I did. I basically built a widget that shows you real-time navigations using the data and the points from our WorkFlow app that we're accessing through standard storage methods. And this is also going to be the step where you're going to be using some of the data, whether it's from Cloud Firestore, Firebase, or you're going to be using some APIs data. But at this stage, you don't need to have all the data that you're going to need when you actually launch the app. You can have some sample data, you can have some fake data, you can have some makeup data. You just need something that you can read and display inside of your app. So typically what I like to do is I like to create a collection and I like to have a couple of records, a couple of documents in that collection with some fake data. And for APIs, you don't need to use real APIs calls. You don't need to go out and get your API keys and all that. You can use something like mockapi.io, which makes it super easy to create various resources and then, get this data, write to this data, and do all kinds of API operations that you're going to be using in your production app, except with fake data that you can delete later, and then simply point your code to the production API access points when you're ready to launch the app. And this way you can build and launch a proof of concept prototype very, very quickly. And most importantly, see if the app that you wanted to build in the beginning is really the app that you're looking at right now. I know I've mentioned this before, but this is super crucial and you want to get this step out of the way as soon as possible. Now that you've built a proof of concept, a prototype, things get a lot easier, and it's mostly downhill from here on. Once I have a working proof of concept, this is where I focus on the data and I focus on the APIs and I do a little bit of optimization. I go back to the app, I see that it's working, I see that it's getting the data, it's displaying the data. And so at this point, I'm comfortable with working with real data. So maybe I'm going to import some real data into my Firestore DB. Maybe I'm going to change my API connection points to production, as well as change my code to point to production API access points. I might also go back to the app and take a look at some of the action flows and see if I can optimize it and somewhat maybe simplify it. Maybe I'm using a bunch of calls that I don't really need. Maybe I have some actions that display some information that was only for debugging purposes. And so at the stage of the game, I'm going to delete all that and just leave the flows that are going to go into the production app. Now, at this last stage, you're going to be adding a little bit of sprinkles at the top because you're going to be looking at ways of making your app even more useful and even more interesting to your end users. And because you already have a working prototype and a proof of concept, and maybe even a couple of steps beyond that because you fixed some of the logic, you replace the data, you fix the APIs, some of the things that you want to be focusing on are integrations and background tasks. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say you're building a dating app and you have a great dating app, everything is working, the logic works, the matching algorithm works, everything is cool, but you've decided you want to add a couple of other features, and one of these features allows the app to send matches to the person at some point in the future. So maybe they picked up the phone, they used the app, they matched with a couple of people, but you've decided that while they're not using the app, you're going to do some of the matching in the background. And then maybe sometime later in the day or in a couple of hours, you're going to send them an email and tell them, hey, I found some great matches for you that you may have overlooked. Or maybe you're building some kind of a calendaring app or an appointment booking app or something of that sort. And you need a way to remind the user that their appointment is coming up. Maybe you're going to do this 24 hours before, or maybe you're going to do 2 hours before, maybe 1 hour before. Both of these scenarios require you to go beyond the no-code app that you're building and think about things like integration and background tasks. And so in both of these examples, this is not something you're going to be doing inside of your no-code builder. This is something that you'll have to employ other tools and other services to achieve. So one way to implement that kind of functionality, such as a reminder or a follow-up type feature, is by using an integration tool such as make.com, which used to be called Integromat. And there are many, many tools that do pretty much the same thing, but this is a tool that I personally like. And so here's an example of one of my integrations that gets started asynchronously. So this integration can start inside of the app. It can start, a couple of days later. It can start at some other time. And I can also change this whole flow to start at a specific time interval or start in a specific time in the future. And suffice to say, this is definitely not something you want to be even thinking about implementing using your no-code app builder. This is definitely something that should be done using a third-party integration tool, which in turn integrates with your no-code app builder using an API. So here's one of my flows that I did for one of my Flutterflow apps a couple of months ago. And so what's interesting about this flow is that it's fully asynchronous. I can start it from within an app. I can start it from somewhere else. I can also change it so that it starts at a set interval or runs once at a specific time or at a time in the future. It's all very, very flexible and customizable. Plus, you'll be able to deliver a ton of value to users by delighting them with this extra functionality that is mostly beyond and above of the scope of the original app. Now, if you enjoyed my 5-step process to building pretty much any kind of an app, you're absolutely gonna love our amazing Patreon community. Our amazing Patreon community is growing fast, and inside the community, you'll find all the apps that I built with WorkFlow, as well as some of the other no-code builder, where you can easily view and or clone each of the apps in order to get a head start. But that's not all. When you join the community, you also get access to extra content such as Q&As, live streams, behind the scenes content, as well as our community exclusive masterclass series where I do a deep dive on a specific topic that the community requests. So the community votes on a topic and I create a video exclusively for our Patreon supporters where I go in depth in that specific topic. Plus, when you join our amazing Patreon community, you're going to be supporting this channel and supporting my work, and that is greatly, greatly appreciated. Now, if you enjoyed this video and you're looking for more tips and tricks when it comes to building no-code apps quickly and easily, check out this video in the corner of your screen. That video is going to give you some more amazing tips and tricks when it comes to building amazing apps.